It's so nice to have you with us here today. I'm Poppy MacDonald, president of USAFacts, and I'm joined by my colleague, Olivia Martin, who is the lead on our State of the Union in Numbers. And we're really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you about it today. The State of the Union in Numbers was envisioned last year when we were talking to a bipartisan group of senators, and we were talking about how the president is required to give an update on the State of the Union each year. And no matter what president's in office, it's typically described as great, never been greater. And we think the state of America is a bit more complex and can really be best described in numbers. And so Olivia has taken a look at the State of the Union by the numbers. Olivia, what is in a State of the Union by the numbers?
Yeah, well, we didn't want to, come up with the topics ourselves. So we started this project by going over 40 years of presidential speeches at the State of the Union addresses and looking over time, like what are the topics that come up time and time again that presidents feel it's most important to address the country on. So we really grounded our product in those topics that have come up for the past several decades. And you'll see that the topics of our State of the Union cover things ranging from COVID-19 and health to defense to education. Just as we mentioned, the speech will cover those topics, but we hope that our State of the Union in numbers will help you have the data and the context behind some of the topics you might be hearing in the president's speech.
Fantastic. And Olivia, I know we talk about the State of the Union, our annual report that we're committed to doing at USAFacts is generally a pretty similar year over year. I'm stating the obvious, but we had to take a different approach to the State of the Union and add some new topics. We had a pandemic that not only impacted people's health, but there was really maybe no part of the country that wasn't touched by this, whether it was state and local revenues or airline travel, or the economy. Olivia, tell us a little bit about what you saw in the State of the Union and the impact of COVID-19.
Yeah, well, as you know, COVID-19 has really changed everything we know about this country in many ways. I think it starts with the human toll of COVID-19. As we all know, millions of Americans have tested positive for COVID-19. Unfortunately, now at this point, we're approaching 500,000 Americans who have died due to causes related to COVID-19, which is equivalent to about 0.1% of the population. So for me, that 0.1% of the population was a little hard to grasp. So one thing we did is we went and got old death data from the CDC going back to 1900, scraped from a bunch of old reports and PDFs. And we saw from those numbers that the 2020 death rate, the total number of people who died over the population, is actually the highest it's been since 1943, which means that 10 people died per 1,000 population in 2020, which is lower than the peak of 14 people per 1,000 during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, but really a lot higher than the average of about 8.3 per 1,000 people since 2000. So that was a very grave statistic that grounded our report about what a unique year 2020 has been. And of course, COVID-19 has affected us in more ways than just the health of our nation. For example, this pandemic has affected our children. We show data showing that many K through 12 students are spending less time learning than they were before the pandemic. And internet access is also complicating things because, as we show in the data, internet access is not equally available across our country. For example, while 2/3 of Black children are reported as having internet available always for their studies, over 3/4 of white and Asian children reported that they had internet. So there's a lot of disparities that are being, I think, deepened by this pandemic. And of course, at USAFacts, we always look back to government and see how this has affected government, and particularly government finances. And this has been a truly historic year for government finances. The federal government spent $6.6 trillion in total in 2020. Of course, much of that in direct stimulus spending. That's equivalent to $19,962 per person, which meant that we spent 91% more than we brought in as revenue, resulting in a pretty historic deficit. But these are just a few of the many ways in which COVID-19 has touched really every aspect of how our country operates.
Thanks, Olivia. It's interesting when you talk about the COVID-19 impact on the economy, and some parts were positive. We saw stock market increases. We saw people saving more money, which I think was counterintuitive. But obviously, there were job losses and closure of businesses that were devastating for Americans. Tell us about what you saw when you looked at the economic picture and how you tried to present that in a way that would be helpful for guiding not only policymakers, but citizens in understanding the overall impact on our economy.
Absolutely. Well, as you said, Poppy, it really was a kind of mixed bag when you look at the economy and numbers in 2020. So, of course, as we all know, monthly unemployment reached really new heights of 14.8% at its highest in April 2020, just after reaching a 50-year low of 3.5% in February, right before the pandemic began. However, an interesting point was that average unemployment across the whole year of 2020 was about 8.1%, which is lower than it was during the Great Recession in 2009, 2010, and 2011. But at the same time, the economy lost a staggering 9.4 million jobs, which is nearly twice as many as we lost from 2008 to 2009 during the Great Recession. So as I think we all know, the leisure and hospitality sector was really the hardest hit in terms of job loss. With so many of the closures and lockdowns across the country, they lost 22% of jobs in the sector. But then followed by that, a fact that not many people know, the next greatest losses in jobs were actually in the government sector, which lost about 6% of their jobs, but 1.3 million jobs, led by a lot of state and local governments, cutting back in their budgets and letting go of employees. Which I think is something we don't always think about when we think about government employment as this really stable source of employment in the economy. So when I hear these two facts that unemployment rates are actually not as bad during the Great Recession, but we lost twice as many jobs, I was having trouble squaring those two facts. And I think one of the things behind that kind of conundrum is the fact that our labor force participation rate, which is a measure of how many people in the economy are either employed or actively searching for work, is the lowest it's been since 1976. So one of the reasons I think that unemployment is not as high as we might expect it to be is the fact that for the current time, a staggering number of people have left the workforce. Some might be early retirement, but maybe others stopped looking for work because they were discouraged. And it's hard to say when this number of people will come back to the workforce. So with all of that, at the same time, people are saving more. I think the stock market, the S&P 500, the NASDAQ, we've never seen them as high as they were. So I think it's a really mixed bag, showing that different parts of the economy have been hurt in different ways, and I think we'll recover at different paces.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex picture, and not only in terms of highs and lows overall for the country, but in terms of how it impacted the country geographically. You talked about the leisure and hospitality industry and how hard it was hit. And I thought, the analysis that we did on USAFacts, looking at how per COVID case, the job loss hit Hawaii much harder, who had very low cases, than it hit a state like New York, who had pretty high cases at one point. And obviously every job loss is devastating, but it's really different picture geographically and demographically. And I think one thing about USAFacts that we try to do is really show that nuance and how people are experiencing life differently, how this national data only tells so much of the story. So we really try to dig in. And I'd love to hear from your perspective, Olivia. What about for individual Americans? How did you see their standard of life change as you looked at the numbers?
Right. I think one of the first places we look at as USAFacts when you think about standard of living is income and how income has changed. So according to some experimental data from the Census Bureau, we saw that half of households experienced a loss of employment income during the pandemic, which resulted in people really trying hard to make ends meet. 16% of households had to rely on borrowing from friends and family to meet their needs in 2020, and 20% relied on the stimulus payments from the government really necessarily to meet their needs. And we've been watching that. That's been an extraordinary effort from the government. They issued 162 million impact payments in the first round of stimulus checks alone, with an average value of $1,600. So that's what it looks like on a family level for income. Again, that's hard to square with what we see at a nation level, because if you looked at income for the entire country, if you stacked every paycheck on top of each other to get to one big number, you'd actually see that total income in 2020 increased over 2019, which is a little confusing. But a big part of that is that we had a really historic influx of support dollars from the government in the forms of unemployment insurance and stimulus checks. But despite that influx of dollars, people were still struggling to make ends meet in 2020. And as you mentioned before, it's not all the same for each family, right? We show that statistic by race in the report. Another way we look at it is who lost employment income by what type of job they had. And what we found in our analysis of the occupation data is that if you were in a lower paying occupation, you were more likely to lose your job in 2020 than if you were in an occupation that paid above the median wage. So what that looked like is that people in these lower jobs, already lower paying jobs, were struggling more. The exception to this, which was really interesting, was frontline workers in health and transportation. So those are the only kind of lower paying large occupations that saw job increases in 2020, primarily because they were called to the front lines to respond to the pandemic. And one other way we think about how people are doing, how families are doing, is how wealth is changing in this country. So interestingly, we haven't seen a really significant shift in household wealth yet in 2020. However, we do show in the report kind of trends over time. And one interesting thing we see when we look at this wealth data over time is that the wealth of the middle 20% of income earners, or the middle class, you could also call them, has grown 66% since 1990. But however, since middle class wealth has grown at such a slower pace than overall wealth, middle class families went from owning 12% of wealth in 1990 to 7% in 2020. So that's just staggering to me, that even though their wealth in dollar terms has increased so much, because other people's wealth is growing so much faster, their share of the wealth in the economy has decreased in the past 30 years, which is quite a staggering statistic.
Wow, it shows how one number alone can be misleading without the context around it, because someone could celebrate, wow, middle class have seen a 66% increase in their share of the wealth. But when you look at the overall picture, you can understand why middle class families are feeling like it's harder to pay for the things that they want and need for their families. So I appreciate that additional analysis and context, Olivia. Olivia, so you talk about wealth of families in the US and how that's been impacted by COVID and changed over time when it comes to the middle class. Curious about America overall. How is our population changing?
Well, Poppy, we'll know the best answer to that question when we get the results from this historic 2020 census, once in a decade opportunity to really understand our country's population. But we do have some insights from, these historical census reports. One that is really interesting to me is how central immigration is to our growth as a nation. So from 2018 to 2019, net immigration made up 38% of our population growth. And as a result of that, as you might expect, that does change what our country looks like. So in 2019, 14% of our country was foreign born, or born in a place outside of the United States, which is the highest it's been since the early 1900s. But a really interesting thing to me is that our country has actually been more diverse by measured of who was not born in this country. But before, in the 1900s, we're still not at that level that we were before, which is fascinating to me. But as a result of this this influx of immigration is our country is looking different than it did before. So I think a lot of people know that the percentages makeup of the population are changing each year. The percentage of the population that is white, non-Hispanic decreases. But an interesting thing that we show in the report is not only is the percentage of people that are white, non-Hispanic decreasing, the absolute number of people who are white, non-Hispanic decreases each year, which is another fascinating thing for me. And then two other things that I think are really important and really impact how our government serves citizens is one, that our population is getting older. So since 1980, people 65 and older have increased from 11% of the total population to 16%, which really impacts, how large programs like Medicare or Social Security will have to be, as well as many other things. Another important statistic is that more people are living alone. So in 1980, 8% of the population lived alone, and now it's 11%. And that affects all kinds of things, such as median household income to things like to how people receive government benefits as well.
Fantastic. So for people who love data as much as we do, our USAFacts fans, all of these data points are available in interactive charts at USAFacts.org at our State of the Union in numbers. Olivia, any last things you want to highlight that you found fascinating as you were putting together this comprehensive report on our country?
Yeah, sure. I'll share two last things. One to me is about college. I'm, graduated from college just a few years ago, so this is on my mind. So between 2000 and 2019, average college tuition costs have increased 60% in the nation. But in that same time period of 2000 to 2019, the average wages for people with a bachelor's degree, just a bachelor's degree, have increased less than 2%, which to me is a really staggering statistic about whether college is paying off for a lot of Americans. Another one is we have seen a lot of changes to our environment in 2020, decreased carbon dioxide emissions, due to a lot of decreased travel in the country. And at the same time, historic year for how our energy consumption is made up. So for the first time in over 130 years of data, renewable energy consumption surpassed energy consumption from coal for the first time. So really interesting mix of things that have been changing in our data, and I hope you enjoy them in our report.
Thank you, Olivia. We're so appreciative of the effort that you've gone to put together a comprehensive report card on our State of the Union. We hope it's helpful to you, our USAFacts fans. Again, it's available at USAFacts.org. You'll see State of the Union prominently featured, and we hope you will dive in and send us your feedback and use the data as a tool to form an opinion about how our country's doing and to advocate for the change that you want to see. Thank you for your time today, Olivia, and to all of you who tuned in today, and look forward to sharing more of the fascinating data behind what's driving our country.
Thanks, Poppy.